I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Sally Blair, Senior Director of Fellowships here at the National Endowment for Democracy. On behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's presentation, The Promise of Constitutionalism, Supporting Democracy and Human Rights in Emerging Democracies in Asia, featuring Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellow Michael Davis. We are delighted to have with us two all-star discussants, Jack Goldstone and Donald Horowitz. Scholars in East and West have lamented liberalism's global retreat in the face of populist views that see liberal constitutionalism with its built-in constraints as undemocratic. Many Asian constitutions do feature strong liberal elements, but governments often fail to deliver on democratic promises. Developments in the Philippines, Thailand, and Myanmar illustrate these failings, as do Hong Kong and Tibet in the context of autonomy. These constitutional crises have led to deep discontent, sometimes manifesting itself through mass protests and widespread social opposition movements. In his presentation, Michael will look at these 5 cases and argue that more can and should be done to promote core constitutional values as a centerpiece of democracy assistance efforts. Until most recently, Michael was a professor in the law faculty at the University of Hong Kong, and he remains a senior fellow in the University Center for Comparative and Public Law. Previously, he served as a professor and director of the graduate program in Law and Public Affairs at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He has held distinguished visiting positions at India's Jindal Global University, Northwestern and Notre Dame universities, and Yale Law School. The author of several books, Michael has also been an active commentator in such newspapers as the New York Times and the South China Morning Post, for which he won the 2015 Human Rights Press Award for commentary by Amnesty International and the Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club. Jack Goldstone is a Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Jr. Professor of Public Policy, an eminent scholar in the Scar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He is also a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center and a global fellow at the Wilson Center. A noted expert on global conflict and terrorism, who has a long list of books and articles to his name. He published Political Demography: How Population Changes Are Reshaping International Security and National Politics. And I note that he writes actively for his blog on global policy and national politics, New Population Bomb. Don Horowitz is the James B. Duke Professor of Law and Political Science Emeritus at Duke University. As part of his highly distinguished career, he has been recognized by many awards and fellowships, but we are most proud to call him part of the NED family, as he was a Reagan-Fussell Fellow himself in 2012-2013, and he is currently a senior fellow at the International Forum and serves on the Endowment's Board of Directors. The author of 7 books, Don is now working on his 8th, truly a magnum opus about constitutional process and design for divided societies. We will now turn the floor over to Michael, who promises to speak for approximately 25 minutes, followed by Jack and Don, who promise to speak for about 10 minutes each. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum @ThinkDemocracy and the endowment @NEDemocracy. If you have not already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones, and let me thank the many staff members involved with this event, especially Michael's research associate, Caitlin Martin. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this microphone working? Thank you, Sally. I owe her thanks for chairing this session, but also for being in charge of our Fellows program for the last 5 months. And Caitlin Martin for running her all over town to interview people who do the kinds of work that I'm going to talk about today. So thank you, Caitlin. Jack and Don, also I appreciate you coming here. They bring expertise superior to mine, and I really look forward to hearing their comments. What I want to do today, well, actually look back at the title. I'm going to focus on what I call emerging democracies. Sometimes when we think of human rights, we think of the basket cases where North Korea or something, and what kind of policies can possibly help the situation there. But actually, more of our human rights work is actually in emerging democracies or quasi-democracies or fragile democracies. And the payback for the work is typically higher there because of the level of access that's allowed. I want to start with a question that's been very much on the minds here of people at the National Endowment. That is liberal democracy in retreat? In Asia, we've long sort of been pestered by the notion of illiberal democracy. And almost, I don't know if it's true, but I suspect that Asia may have even invented the term, because a lot of the early literature on illiberal democracy was about Asian countries. Here at the endowment, just a month, actually a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, Yasha Monk noted that popular concern in the West had developed also over what some people viewed as a kind of undemocratic liberalism, and giving cause for people to support kind of populist candidates or populist ideas, both in Europe and the United States. I'm going to argue the real problem, however, is the failure to maintain liberal constitutional institutions. And that when we do work on this kind of work in Asia, we should pay careful attention to that. In fact, I would argue that it's peculiar, maybe more peculiar to Asia than other parts of the world, that much of the human rights debate is centered on constitutionalism. Maybe it's because there are no regional human rights treaties in the region. So unlike other parts of the world where those kinds of institutions are at play, almost all of the debates in the Asian countries about establishing democracy and human rights are constitutional, and all the problems and political debates that surround that are of a constitutional nature. Here on this slide, I've listed, when it comes to democracy, Asian politics gives rise to questions about illiberalism, as I just mentioned, populism, expediency, corruption of democracy. When it comes to enforcement of human rights, a lack of judicial independence or institutional autonomy, and again, corruption is a problem in emerging democracies in Asia. Basic rights may often be ignored or poorly protected. I think especially free speech is often suppressed, but economic rights relating to poverty may not be addressed at all, or the environment. Discrimination is a problem, of course, in traditional societies. Gender discrimination is an old problem, but in Asia, I think especially minority rights have been a very prevalent concern. In fact, if you think of wars after World War II, most Asian wars have arisen out of national ethnic groups and their insurgencies and so on. There have often been internal wars. A picture here on my left, I guess your left as well, is the Rohingya, which is just one of the examples in Asia. Here I just put a list of all the countries that I would argue are in some degree of constitutional stress, many cases crisis in Asia and East Asia. In fact, the list is so long, it gets probably the majority of the countries in the region. And I think for people in the human rights business, that should be a concern, that if most of the countries that we're dealing with are in a state of constitutional crisis, then we should be asking something about constitutionalism. I won't read the list, you can see it, but it's not unique to Asia. We know the famous cases of the last couple years in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Ukraine are also of this nature. In Europe, we see emerging constitutional crises in Poland, Hungary, the Balkans. And of course, when we get to Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, then again, it's the majority of the countries. If I made the list, it would probably be longer than the one we see in Asia. So I put this up because I think it draws our attention to the problem. Now, here's an outline of the argument I want to make about this. Essentially three main bullet points you see there at the top. The first two are foundational. I want to talk about a little bit about why we promote democracy and human rights and how we do it. And then I want to discuss these illustrative cases that Sally had already mentioned. And then finally, I want to talk about avenues to solving the problem. I especially want to emphasize the importance of constitutional fundamentals. And in this regard, I've listed the kinds of things that go into a constitution, protecting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. But I think it's important to keep in mind that what constitutionalism does is it provides a venue for public discourse. It provides a place for empowerment, a place to mediate conflicts. If it's not working, then those things don't get done. And I think this is the problem that we face in many of these cases. And when I add indigenization to the list, I'm just saying that in every country on earth where there's constitutionalism, there's some indigenous qualities that are at play. I like Aung San Suu Kyi's quote a few years ago. She says, as long as the fundamentals are in place, then there's room for local institutional embodiment. So I don't want the indigenous to replace the fundamentals, but I appreciate that if it contributes to the process of empowerment and discourse and mediation, then we should pay careful attention to it. It could be a monarch, the right the people have to appeal to their monarch, or something of that nature. So I add this indigenous quality. And finally, I want to add in my major concern list in this outline is that we should make greater use of scholarly channels. I think Asia is unique in some ways in the high elevated position given to academics and scholars. We can say things and read it on the front page the next day. So if you want those ideas out there, that's one channel I think in the Asian context you shouldn't neglect. I'll develop these ideas a little further as we go along. Why promote democracy and human rights? Here, Mandela's answer, he talks about enlightened and informed population as being the key to successful promotion of democracy. And I think he would take the first answer. That is, it's the right thing to do to promote these things. But we can't always count on politics choosing the first answer, so there are strategic answers. I just participated in a RAND Corporation conference on foreign policy towards Asia just a couple weeks ago, and the former commander of the U.S. Pacific Forces, Sam Locklear, he was asked what he thought the secret was to U.S. power in Asia. He says there's two ingredients. One is that the United States is viewed, in his view, as a benevolent power, and the second is that it has power. It has military power. And he says the second without the first won't work. Then it just becomes a kind of imperialism. So this leads to the next statement here where I point out that most Asian democracies align with other democracies. So if security is your argument, I think the argument in Asia is very powerful that the promotion of democracy and human rights in the region is very instrumental to our security and to the security of the region. And of course, trade and development relies on the rule of law and human rights. Now, will the United States abandon this sort of approach? Will the new administration trade human rights for security and trade? That was a big question at the RAND conference. Everybody was worried about a vacuum. Will the U.S. remain a benevolent power? Will human rights and development assistance be cut back? We don't know the answer to that. I know Carl Gershman is going to be testifying about some of this problem in Congress, I think, tomorrow. So what are the tools in the U.S. arsenal? I don't want to spend a lot of time here because I'm speaking to an audience that knows the tools well. I'll just characterize them mostly as human rights reporting and human rights promotion, okay? Are we doing enough? I think when it comes to reporting, this Department of State reports, the Human Rights Watch report, which I feature in the picture here, are necessary sources for anybody researching human rights in Asia. So they're very important. Media outlets from the Radio Free Asia, the Voice of America, these sort of official voices that reach into countries where there may be a lack of free speech, but also the private media in most of these fragile democracies are reporting tools. Skipped the page. Are constitutional fundamentals a core concern when it comes to promotion of human rights, or are they an afterthought? I've done interviews with a lot of the people on the list of organizations where U.S. official promotion policy tends to be channeled, and everybody is aware of constitutional concerns. But is it a fundamental or a core concern? Seemed a bit doubtful when talking to people. It's sort of like we know there's a rule of law problem when we're promoting elections, so we get to it. but I'm not sure how comprehensive that attention is. So if I'm asking for us to do something more, I really appreciate the work. One of the things I found, I've been on 30 years on the other side in Asia, dealing with people coming from here. Coming over here, I got to see the serious work that people are doing. And so that is much appreciated, but I'm kind of wondering how we can tweak it so that we don't have a constitutional crisis in practically every country we're dealing with. Okay, public diplomacy channels, Human Rights Watch, OSF, and others. So is there sufficient emphasis on constitutional development? Or is there a on scholarly engagement? That is the question I'm asking. So turning to my illustrative cases, I'm going to make quick work of them. I chose 3, Philippines, Thailand, and Myanmar. From my original list of constitutional crises, you could see I could have chosen 10 or 15 that all suffer from these problems. I picked these because they illustrate both the centrality of constitutionalism and threats it faces. Every one of these countries are in the midst of a very strong constitutional debate over new constitutions in the case of 2 of them, and over whether the old constitution is going to survive when it comes to the Philippines. So these countries, I think, are good case studies. All 3 have experienced failed democracy and constitutional breakdown. All are attempting to come back from martial or military rule, except the Philippines sort of waffling on that. It attempted in the 80s, and we don't know where it's headed today. I chose 2 autonomy cases because I think autonomy in constitutions or federalism have been key ingredients in the Asian constitutional story. Okay? There's so many countries with insurgent groups in them, ethnic national groups that they have to deal with, and so autonomy regimes have been very important, often written into constitutions. I just chose 2 that I'm more familiar with, where I can offer a very quick and tidy comment. On the Philippines, I sort of assign a label to each of these countries. The Philippines, I give it the label constitution without constitutionalism. I worry in the Philippines about the lack of institutional independence. I have a lot of students from the Philippines who work in the Human Rights Commission. There's been problems in the court where they try to, when a new administration comes in, they try to get rid of justices from the old that were appointed by the old administration. There's problems of religious and ethnic insurgency in the country, big problems of poverty, crime, and poor governance. I put the picture here and ask, is Duterte the face of Asia's future? This kind of populist leader who's willing to use vigilante justice to get things done. So this Philippine case, and people that my former students there are struggling against him, and many people are under serious intimidation. So when this kind of development occurs, this kind of populist turn, what is the price? And then if we turn to Thailand, it's interesting. If you look at Thaksin Shinawatra, in some ways, Duterte is his student. I mean, he was the guy who killed 2,500 drug dealers during his administration. So this idea of taking a heavy hand to deal with problems is not new. In the case of Thailand, we have a constitutional monarchy and constitutional crisis. We know they have this problem of lèse majesté. We know this is used to silence opposition. The idea, it's not narrowly applied to criticisms of the king, but essentially the military uses it for its own purposes. Okay? So this is a big problem. There was a coup, we know that, and then immediately, like in most Asian cases, they set about constitution business. And first they have an interim constitution which gives the military sweeping power, and now they have a new one which is approved by the public, was supposed to come into force in 2017 and has now been deferred to 2018, and God knows how long it will be deferred. And on its front, it provides that this sweeping article empowering the military shall continue to apply until a cabinet is sworn in. So all they have to do is keep deferring the election, and we can keep the cabinet at bay for some time and keep the military in power. It has other problems, and there are scholars on the ground writing reports and responding to the problems about the Constitutional Court, about the Human Rights Commission, an appointed Senate, and it seems that they're trying to set up an electoral system that will make sure the Shinawatras don't win the next election as they have all the last 3 or 4. So this, again, the Constitution is the tool. I have a picture here at the bottom showing all the cases of punishment for lèse majesté, which was prepared by the news website Prachatai, of which one of my fellows is the head right here in the room. Myanmar, again, a big constitutional debate, very military-friendly constitution that gives the military enough seats in the legislature to block any amendments, gives the military control of ministries of defense, home affairs, and border, sets up a National Defense and Security Council to sort of override everything, and so on. So then Aung San Suu Kyi and her party wins the election, but can they do anything about the Rohingya problem? Probably not. They could speak up, but they can't. They have no power over the ministries that actually carry out policies in Rakhine State and in areas that affect the Rohingya. She's been criticized for failing to speak up, but I have a feeling she's very politically vulnerable. Of course, in the past week, there's an assassination of a prominent Muslim politician, signaling that things could get worse before they get better. So these constitutional debates in these countries are very severe. I would just say in the case of my two autonomy models, Hong Kong, every political debate in Hong Kong is over the Constitution. I've got Article 23 here because I was one of the guys involved in that, and we brought 500,000 people to the street to try to stop these national security laws, secrecy laws, sedition laws, and stuff the government was proposing. 500,000 people stood up and objected over an article in the Basic Law. And when we saw umbrellas on the street 2 years ago, those were umbrellas over another article in the Basic Law promising universal suffrage. So again, this constitutional aspect. In the case of Tibet, the Chinese Constitution guarantees autonomy for these regions, but when you have a crappy autonomy, what autonomy means in the Chinese context is more direct control. That's simply what it does. It takes out all the intermediate layers of government and says we directly rule these areas. So in effect, it's the antithesis of autonomy. I would note the Tibetans even tried to write a memorandum arguing how to rule Tibet under the Chinese Constitution. Again, a constitutional argument. And that memorandum in its content very much informed by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So now I want to get to the avenues of engagement. What I've done here is just, for efficiency, listed 7 things that I think are important. The first 3 on this slide, things that people in this business of promoting democracy would want to pay attention to. The first one, in effect, I'm arguing that you should start early, that you promote early understanding and articulation of broad constitutional goals among social movement activists. One of the things they do is they bring down the dictator, and then the next day they don't know what to do. And then they start squabbling with each other, or someone like the Brotherhood shows up and takes over, and the result of their revolution is defeated. It's just the problem that if you don't know both what you're against and what you're for, the chances of success with a constitutional task are very low. The second thing is emphasize liberal constitutional fundamentals. Here is the same argument I made earlier about what I think constitutionalism is and does. Third, confront illiberal authoritarian arguments. Stability is more than top-down control. That's essentially the argument. Indigenization, yes. Asian values in that sense, yes. But if the argument simply is, there has to be a response to that. You have to have an argument about how constitutionalism delivers stability and order. 4, focus on inclusive constitution making and design. Early participation in the process limits fracture and reversal. 5, focus on institutions to secure human rights, such as human rights commissions. The United States doesn't have this. Doesn't have corruption commissions, human rights commissions, but these are very important tools across Asia. And paying attention, having research on it, studying it, knowing how they work. There's at least a dozen human rights commissions across Asian countries, all approved under the international scheme as Class A, all a failure in some way or another? Can something be done about it? Can we understand how it works? 6, emphasize constitutional judicial review. In my view, this is the engine. People could say, well, you don't have to have constitutional review, you can have some alternative. Trust me, every democracy, virtually every democracy has it. Whether it works or not often depends on the independence of the courts. But democracy is not elections alone. It's more than that, and it's important to appreciate that. And next, prioritize federalism and autonomy arrangements. I've already made an argument for that. I love the argument in the Journal of Democracy a couple of years ago by Juan Lenz, Alfred Stepan, and Yogendra Yadav about this kind of what they call it India's state-nation concept, a kind of inclusive federalism that's not just repressive. Unfortunately, in Asia, very often when they have autonomy, it's used, as I said with Tibet, as a tool to repress rather than a tool to include. So I think these are important things. Here, what I've listed are topics for scholars. Some overlap. Quickly, a quick look at it, you can see we should be funding research on popular protest and social movements, comparative constitutional fundamentals, human rights and culture, inclusive constitution making, national human rights institutions, minority and religious rights, constitutional review, corruption and human rights, constitutionalism and poverty, you could say it more shortly than I do there, federalism, autonomy arrangements, and so on. These topics, and this graphic shows the kinds of concerns that underlie these topics. I think doing research in that area, and to me, it's important that research be collaborative with people from the region. So I stuck this final slide in here saying what I think the U.S. could do. It could take advantage of its liberal constitutional experience. The liberal model does not assure success of constitutionalism, but its absence certainly ensures failure, okay? So I'm an unadulterated liberal when it comes to that. Not liberal world economic order, all of that. Let's not worry about that. Talking about a liberal constitutional system, liberal institutions. 2, assemble and publicize useful constitutional experience. The U.S. has more resources than anyone I know to bring scholars together. In fact, I will bet if you go into any country in Asia, maybe Myanmar excluded, you'll find that the leading scholars are actually trained here. So there is a channel already for engaging those people, but from my discussions and my own experience in the region, they're under-engaged. And finally, tap into U.S. educational leadership and global connections. I think Asian societies are especially receptive to academic input. While someone from NED will immediately be crucified for being foreign interference, Larry Diamond isn't. He's the headline. If we can engage people, and when Larry sits down with 4 or 5 colleagues of mine in Hong Kong, they're all the headline. We can engage people in that way. We can get around this objection because there's just not that resistance to academics that we're seeing to our sort of staff that go and try to engage. So when I talk to people here in town, they're all saying, well, we have to stay low. We can't be visible because we undermine the people we're trying to assist. But if you engage through academic channels, I think this is a badly neglected target of the work we're trying to do. And I would say it should be collaborative. If you're allowing funding, grants, these people should show up with a proposal that includes partners in foreign countries. I'm actually a party to an EU Horizon 2020 grant where we have a university partner in each of the BRICS countries to study the effects of European policy on access to justice in BRICS countries. So I think this channel is not sufficiently used to do our work. And so I'll close with that, and thank you.
Well, that was a terrific presentation. Thank you very much. Thanks to NED for having this event and for everyone for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the background factors that are leading to the trends in specific countries that Mike mentioned. The argument I'm making comes from a new book that just came out last month. It's Revolution and Rebellion, Early Modern World, a new edition. And it covers incidences of revolution and rebellion for the last 400 years, but they all have a common theme. And the common theme is when institutions start to decay, we see a decline in political stability and eventually acute political crises. And this applies to democracies as well as to authoritarian or traditional regimes. And I worry, as people here at NED and around the world do, that democracy is failing. And not just because we have a few countries, Thailand, Turkey, Venezuela, that seem to be consolidated democracies that have lost their way, but because even in core democratic countries, US, Western Europe, the popular support for democracy, the attachment to constitutions and constitutional order seems to be fading. We see this not only in the rise of movements and politicians that actively disregard constitutional liberalism and human rights, but we see it even in mass surveys that ask people about the importance of these things in their lives. Now, we know that democracy fails when there's corruption and polarization and dysfunctional government. We've seen that in emerging democracies like those in Nigeria and Pakistan at different times. One worries now about Malaysia. Wherever you see this trinity of corruption, polarization, and dysfunctional government, people get distressed. But we're also seeing this hostility or anxiety about why should we care so much about democracy or constitutions among middle and working classes. You see it in Europe, you see it in Asia, you see it in the United States. Hong Kong, when I was there, suffers a lot of the same kind of stagnation for middle and working classes, anxiety about the future, about social mobility, polarization of politics, and people becoming alienated from the political leadership. Now, there certainly has been tremendous improvements in quality of life around the world, but most of the economic benefits have gone to the wealthy and to knowledge workers. You have highly educated elites and you have people at the head of large financial, manufacturing, and government institutions. They've done very well. But for large numbers of people who are in kind of core construction and manual labor, these are the people we used to salute as the people who made countries and held them up. They've suffered a major loss of dignity as well as jobs. They see things rigged against them, and as a result, they're starting to reject the system. They're developing a hatred, it's a strong word, but we do see it in the rants online and Facebook. We see hatred of status quo elites. It's hard to, even in this country, the real hatred aimed by people against one of the major presidential candidates, the chants of lock her up, she's a criminal, more severe than we've had in recent years in what we can like to consider constitutionally protected elections. But there is this hatred. It's aimed at status quo elites, at experts, and at the whole system that people feel has failed them. And that creates openings for a different kind of government. It creates large groups of people. And people say in America, well, Trump was not elected with a majority of the popular vote. Fair enough, but he got 60 million votes, tens of millions of enthusiastic, active followers who support him. And there are people following similar movements and parties elsewhere. In the Philippines, with the rise of Duterte as president, what people are looking for is a strong man or woman, as perhaps in France, who offers to build national strength by defending traditional values, being tough on crime and foreigners, and providing an economic protectionism. Even if it's largely symbolic, people don't care so much to probe the details of rational argument. They want to know that their concerns are being addressed. And if the promise of a wall or the promise of tougher borders is given, then they feel at least someone understands my concerns. And what's very unfortunate is those offers to build national strength by building walls are more appealing to some people than appeals to constitutions, human rights, traditional liberalism. So I feel that this has put us, when we look at Asia today, in a new Cold War. And in some sense, I draw an analogy, details are in the new book, between the transition from World War I to World War II and Cold War I to Cold War II. So Cold War I pitted Western liberalism against communism and was fought very extensively in Asia through proxy wars, spycraft, and weapons competition. Like World War I, the first Cold War ended with excessive hubris by the winners and an economic boom that was followed by an economic collapse. So after 1989, we felt end of history, ideological fights were over, we could make the world safe for capitalism and credit and all kinds of spending that resulted in a bubble and a collapse. Not dissimilar, we had a Great Recession instead of a Great Depression, but the impact on people around the world was quite powerful. Cold War II, what I think we're in today, pits Western liberalism against this capitalist authoritarianism or undemocratic liberalism. That is, people accept the principle of competitive markets and global economic competition. What they don't accept is the idea that constitutions, citizen sovereignty, and constraints on the executive are the best ways to advance national interests. And the loss of confidence that that's true handicaps our efforts to develop and spread democracy throughout the world. And it's particularly tense in Asia, where China presents itself as the very successful model of a country that has stability, security, rapid economic growth, success in global markets, an advancing digital economy, and does all of those things while deliberately excluding even the discourse of constitutionalism and human rights. So Cold War II, we are again in this struggle, and it is again operating via proxy wars, spycraft, and weapons competition, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in Syria. We are again seeing this struggle. And I believe it's now a global struggle against authoritarianism, in which Western countries are trying to hold on to the ideal that constitutionalism, protection for human rights, is the most important principle for progress in a society. But we're fighting that struggle against authoritarian countries that seem stronger than they have been for decades, and with a weaker overall global economy and great pressures from immigration and terrorism that put countries on the defensive. So very briefly, what is to be done? Here I want to echo the contributions of our other two panelists. I think we do need serious scholarship on constitutionalism, but not on constitutionalism as an abstract ideal or as a particular model, but rather the type of thing that Professor Horowitz is doing on trying to understand constitutionalism as something that can be varied and made practical by paying attention to the varied contexts. Need to focus in general on how accountability can be brought to a variety of different contexts. Here we are at the United States, again, failing to set the right model with recent legislation proposed to again allow companies to conceal transactions with foreign governments and foreign firms, something that we had said have to fight corruption, have to reveal this. If we don't stay with those principles, it's hard to maintain them. I think we also need serious scholarship on how the middle and working class can regain positive momentum. Without them on the side of constitutional government, it's going to be impossible to sustain effective democracies. I think we need to focus on support for civil society as a basic human right. People have the right, that right must be protected to form organizations, associations. We need support for free press and truth as basic to human well-being. I thought it was appalling, the silence of the world when Turkey was becoming the world's leading country in imprisoning journalists. But even in this country, the assault on free press and truth has become taxing. That's a battle that needs to be fought. And finally, I'll close by saying, in the Cold War, we spent an awful lot of effort to understand other cultures, to fit the medium and the message of the value of democracy to people who were under pressure around the world. Somehow I feel that the effort to spread democracy has been reduced to the notions of prosperity and freedom as kind of self-evident ideas, but they're not self-evident to people who are struggling for material security and dignity as the basics of life. The followers of ISIS are drawn by promises of dignity and security for people in the Middle East who feel they lack it. People are drawn to anti-democratic movements around the world if they feel following a strong leader gives them security and dignity where they are disrespected in the context of a highly competitive, meritocratic, knowledge-rewarding regime. So I think we have a lot of work to do to restore the appeal and strength of constitutionalism, and I think following the kind of scholarship that our other panelists have laid out is indeed the way to get there. Thank you.
Which is currently one of their demands, or the number of states would be 7 for the minorities and 1 for the Burmans, and that would be reflected in the upper house of the legislature. The Burmans are somewhere between 60 and 70% of the total population, probably somewhere in the middle of those numbers. These are not easy demands to negotiate or to meet. They go back, actually, the minority demands in Burma go back to a particularly favorable moment, the Panglong Agreement of 1947, between Aung San, the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, and several, but not all, of the minority leaders. And that agreement would provide the kind of federalism that's closer to what most of the minorities would like today, but I think it's completely infeasible when one considers the views of the military and even of civilian politicians in the Burman heartland. So what I'm trying to say is, look, I'm not reviving the old ancient hatreds argument, which is to say that there's nothing new in ethnic relations. There are plenty of new conflicts out there, and there's also a certain level of accommodation in some places. Taiwan, for example, has done a really good job at getting rid of and overcoming historical animosities. What I do want to say, though, is that distinctive histories give rise to distinctive problems, and some of these problems are very deep-seated indeed. The same goes for majority hostility to some minorities. The Burmese Buddhist antipathy to Muslims didn't develop as the Rohingya population became more conspicuous. Far from it. It's visible in the anti-Indian riots of 1938, led by Buddhist monks and singling out for particularly harsh killing the Indian Muslims who were then in Burma rather than the larger Hindu population. The same goes for anti-Muslim riots in Sri Lanka. There was a very ugly one in the south of Sri Lanka in 2014, but there was another ugly one in the south of Sri Lanka in 1915. So we're talking about a lot of deeply ingrained behavior that has to be dealt with over time and within the context of constitutional processes. It's not just ethnic majorities and minorities. I mean, we could talk about those all day, but they're not the only configurations that present challenges. Social groups that are disadvantaged by democratic outcomes fight back and seek less democratic arrangements. That's the Thai story. It's the hostility of the Bangkok bureaucratic elite and also people in the south. Don't limit it just to Bangkok. It's also people in the south of Thailand who are hostile to the peasant majority supporting Thaksin in the north and northeast of the country. And that's what led to demands for a less majoritarian constitution. The hostility of the so-called yellow shirts, that's the people who want less democracy, is very, very powerful. I own a yellow shirt that was given to me by the yellow shirts, and I can tell you that underlying the yellow shirts, there's a red-hot anger. So there are many sources of reactions against democracy. And furthermore, even those that might have been thought to be secure, that is, democratic institutions that might have been thought to be secure, have often proved remarkably and unpredictably fragile. Malaysia and Sri Lanka at independence really had a kind of veneration of British justice And yet Mahathir in Malaysia and Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka have each managed to sack a chief justice with impunity. And following the sacking of the chief justice in each country, the courts became more quiescent, much more quiescent in Malaysia, so that one can scarcely think about serious judicial review that might discomfort majority governments in that country at this point. So because of the sheer diversity of obstacles, there is no single answer to the problem of constitutionalism. Michael refers to constitutions that will fit varied context. I think there's no alternative to that. He also talks about inclusive constitution making as an important step. Now, I'm not sure what he means exactly by the word inclusive because it has two possible meanings in this context. Does it mean that every component of the society is represented? That's what I would call inclusive. Or does it mean participatory constitution making, often recommended by third-party experts from outside a given country, which means typically that the Constitutional Commission goes around the country and asks people questions regarding the Constitution and constitutionalism that they typically can't answer and therefore don't provide useful feedback on. Quite a lot of time has been wasted on this kind of exercise. Inclusive constitution making is a very different thing, and there's no reason why representative democracy can't do this job. But inclusion is important if and only if the process leaves lots of room for argumentation, bargaining, and deliberation. In other words, isn't rushed, so that the participants emerge from the process with greater understanding of their opponent's aims, apprehensions, and ways of doing business. These are useful skills in operating a democracy afterward. Constitutional process, if done right, is a neglected resource, a kind of school for democratic behavior to follow the constitutional process. I'm a lot more skeptical of any arguments for asymmetric federalism. Michael didn't say he's for asymmetric federalism in Tibet, but I'll bet that's what he has in mind in a democratic China. If we could wave the wand and create a democratic China, would we want asymmetric federalism? That is to say, with respect to Tibet or Xinjiang for that matter, that is to say, special powers in particular regions, not a uniform federalism on the model that we're familiar with, for example, in the United States. Many more countries should be federal than the fewer than 30 countries that are currently federal. The Forum on Federation lists, I think, at last count, 26 countries that are federal. Many more federations should exist given the diversity of interests and group identity in many countries, even relatively small countries. But the asymmetric federal idea, it seems to me, in heterogeneous regions such as Tibet and Xinjiang, risks one of two common outcomes. One, the central government gets tired of those special powers and reneges or revokes them. I can give you chapter and verse on this from Ethiopia, Eritrea, from Cameroon, and from the Borneo states in Malaysia, among others. Or else the other possible outcome is that the majority is allowed to deal with, which is to say to oppress, minorities in the region, often settlers in the region, as in the case of both Xinjiang and Tibet, without any checks from the outside. Asymmetric federalism, if you want to pursue the idea, depends on a very strong rule of law, and nobody has quite cracked the rule of law problem in most countries. And in fact, in some countries, one element of the rule of law can deflect the claims for the rule of law in general. I have in mind, for example, the Indonesian Supreme Court, which used to take the prize for corruption, probably still does. In fact, if you won a case in the Indonesian Supreme Court, you would have to check very carefully to see that what the clerk of the court issued afterwards made you the winner, or whether the clerk had reversed the judgment of the court in return for some consideration. And buying of justice is well done. I'm going to close with an anecdote. I once asked a very well-known Indonesian lawyer how he prepared for trial. This is a kind of lawyer's question to a lawyer. And he thought and finally he burst out laughing. He said, Of course nobody prepares for trial. It's a question of who pays the judge more. Now, in the Supreme Court of Indonesia, judicial independence is very powerful, and it has prevented the reform of the Supreme Court of Indonesia. So you don't want just independent judges. You want to do a lot of other things with the rule of law if you're going to shape developments in a favorable direction. Thank you very much.
Brilliantly in all ways, both in substance and in timing. So thank you all. And we now have time for questions, answers, conversation. We're going to take several questions at once. And if you could identify yourself and keep your comment or question brief, that would be much appreciated. So we will start with this gentleman here.
Tom Timberg, consultant. Thank you, obviously, very much for, I think, many things, all of which I agree with. But I wonder if, as Americans, we tend to look at a specific document called a Constitution. In fact, our states have specific documents. However, historically, liberal democracies have often not had constitutions because often the coming to the kind of consensus required was too much of a strain for the system. They lived on various kinds of understanding. The British, of course, are the obvious example, but there are lots of other ones as well. And it seems to me that what is critical here is the commitment by all members of the political elite and their socialization over time to a set of standards and to a understanding that following those standards are in the interest of the system as a whole. And my two examples, and then I will let about what like from response, are Joseph Schumpeter's argument that capitalist democracy was doomed because it was devoted to capitalism, and the feudal values of law that protected it would eventually be undercut. The other one is a very personal example. In Bangladesh, the late Talukdar Manur Zaman, who incidentally belonged somewhat to the right there, was an advocate of the concern that there should be general commitment to constitutional democracy. And I remember a launch party which he did in his apartment, to which incidentally a couple of former prime ministers and chiefs of the army were invited and came, in which he argued to all of these people from all sides of the political spectrum that it was in their interest to promote a consensual democracy rather than an alternative alternation of political parties. I'm not sure anybody listened, but they came.
Okay, thank you very much. Right here, Gia Nodia.
Okay, Mike. I will try again. My question is maybe continuation of the previous one. Michael, you mentioned this concept of constitution without constitutionalism with regards to Philippines, but I just wonder whether it is how specific this problem is to Philippines, because I mean constitutional problem may be that not right things are written in constitution, let's say so. That constitution does not provide as such for protection of this and that. But another thing is that you may have good things written in the constitution, but there is no commitment of actors to the constitution, right? To any constitution, or in general, actors, whether it's political actors or other people, are not used to, respect constitution as such, right? So, how would you see the balance of these two problems? I mean, is it that it's Philippines where you have relatively good constitution but no commitment? In other places, its constitutions are bad. So how these two things work together?
Okay, and one in the back row, and that will be our round for this. Then we'll take another round.
Real Ismail, I'm an attorney here. I grew up in Sri Lanka. Nobody mentioned globalization, though Professor Goldstone addressed many of the issues identified with globalization. My question is, has the rise of this anti-globalization undermined support for developing constitutional institutions?
Okay, thank you very much. Michael, would you like to take the first crack?
Thank you, and Sally, thank you for the questions. On just a written or unwritten tradition, I suppose if it's a new constitutional system, they've never really developed an unwritten tradition. They're probably going to have to start with a text and not simply rely on as the British have long done on a historical practice. Although when I talk about indigenization, I think that an unwritten tradition will creep in to the application of the text anyhow. Okay, so I think that's maybe, I don't know if that's responsive to the point you raised. When it comes to either a bad constitution or a lack of commitment, I had an interesting experience with this because during the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, I was on the street debating with a leader of a think tank in Beijing about whether the students were undermining the rule of law by protesting or whether the government, in applying the Constitution rather liberally, was undermining it. And I was very comfortable arguing that, well, it's the government. You take such liberty with the words like universal suffrage, then you undermine the rule of law, the constitutional system. So it's the Chinese government, which of course doesn't have much regard for that. But I was kind of brought to a different view of how this kind of undermining occurs, because I immediately went to India for a semester. And there, the Constitution and all of this stuff it's brilliant. Like you say, the Philippine Constitution, it's fine. It has lots of institutions designed for checks and balances, separation of powers, and all sorts of things. But there's no rule of law either. So it seems to me either of those channels can produce a constitution without constitutionalism. And so that's why I'm kind of arguing here. There's no tidy response. I agree with Don. There's no tidy response to it, but it seems to me we have to pay attention to it. And when I bring in indigenization, I'm just saying, yeah, don't cast out the fundamentals, but we just have to do the work. If it's a problem with the military, we have to research and deal with that problem. Religion might be a factor. There's all kinds of things that are populism, poverty. Duterte is riding to success on poverty, essentially. People are frustrated. So I think that doesn't say to us the Constitution, this work is useless. I think it just requires us to be specific about the kinds of problems in each country we're dealing with. And I think it's important to popularize that discussion. It's not something for smoke-filled rooms. It's something that somehow has to be brought to public commitment, public understanding. Otherwise, a democracy, I don't think, can succeed. Thank you.
Well, I think the questions raise a chicken and egg problem, kind of which comes first, the commitment to citizen sovereignty and accountability or a codification of procedures to assure that. I come down pretty firmly that you need the commitment to accountability first, and that whatever problems arise in the written Constitution, it doesn't have to be a single document, it can be a set of different laws, it just needs to be an agreed upon set of procedures. If you have a commitment to judicial review, if you have a commitment to citizen sovereignty, free press, human rights, the documents can be fixed over time. The American Constitution started out with provisions on slavery that proved very troublesome. They led to a civil war, 50,000 violent deaths. So the U.S. Constitution, for all the credit it's given, has always been recognized as a very imperfect document. What matters is the principles behind it were widely enough accepted that people fought for them and have fought to maintain them. And that is what I think we're losing. And I'll close by saying I think Schumpeter could be right. If the decades-long pattern of 1% of the people gaining most of the gains from economic growth continues, you're not going to continue to get a broad popular commitment to the system that provides for that outcome. Globalization, I'll say, is somewhat like nuclear weapons. It's a very powerful force. Whether it produces a good or bad outcome really depends on what elements of globalization take precedence. So if American culture spreads and with that carries knowledge and commitment to democratic practices and human rights, as was the case for much of the 60s and 70s, globalization can be a very powerful force to promote democracy, civil rights. On the other hand, if what spreads in globalization is the notion of fear, the value of authoritarian rule, the perils of immigration, and the exploitative characteristic of capitalist regimes, then globalization will be very negative. I fear the balance has tilted toward the negative even in the US in recent years, so it's up to those who support globalization to try and tilt the balance the other way.
I'm going to take the questions in inverse order. Sharil Ismail's question was whether declining support for globalization is undermining support for constitutionalism. I haven't seen any research on this. I think this is really and truly an empirical question about what the connection between the two might be. So I have to say I'm agnostic with respect to the answer. Gianodia, the respect for how to develop respect for the Constitution. I agree with Michael's answer on this. I think we need both, and it's certainly the case that it's hard to imagine generating the consensus out of thin air. It's got to come out of some experience. The Indonesians, had a very harsh authoritarianism at the end, not so much early on, but it got nastier and more nepotistic at the end. And when the Indonesians got together to begin the installation of a democratic regime, I think they knew what they didn't want. And that led them to think about what they did want. In general terms, they wanted a democratic dispensation. Almost nobody disagreed with that, except those who had been nominated members of the parliament and could never have won an election. Those were the only dissenters, and eventually the nominated members of parliament forced the only vote that the Indonesians took in their entire constitutional process, and it was the vote to eliminate their seats, which came out in just the right direction, it seems to me. Tom Timberg asked, I think, two questions, or made 2 points. And I want to push back a little bit on both of them. The British, the New Zealanders, the Israelis, those are the three main countries that don't have, at least in theory, a written constitution, but they all now have judicial review. And it's constitutional judicial review, and it takes place through various processes. Sometimes it takes place in the judges' chambers when they figure out that certain statutes have standing above other statutes, and sometimes it takes place more explicitly, as in Britain, for example, which began to have judicial review as a result of the European Court of Human Rights. And they said, gee, we may as well have our own version, which, of course, they now have. The second question that Tom raised at the end, that I'm not, and it was sort of slipped under the door, so I'm not sure that everybody really got the import of it, and I'm not sure I did, but I'm going to try. He said, why not consensual democracy rather than majoritarian democracy? Do I have it right? This is an argument associated with Arendt Liephardt, who's written a book on exactly this question. But as a matter of fact, I think there's a lot of evidence that the most inclusive governments, that is, the ones that defy, that embrace a supermajority, maybe almost unanimity of all factions and groups. And I'm talking now not about authoritarian one-party regimes. I'm talking about competitive regimes where everybody's included in the governing process. I think they have some grave deficiencies. When everybody's on the government benches, where's the opposition going to come from? And I think that's a very important thing if you're going to have the election next time. But I think I can also show you that the most inclusive governments have a tendency to fall apart because the majority doesn't really want to include everybody. And when the majority can get rid of that kind of a government, it will. I can give you chapter and verse on that, but I don't think that most people really want to hear every country that's had that experience from this podium.
Thank you. Johnson in the back, thank you for your patience. Then Mark Plattner and Susan Alberts.
Hello, thank you. Johnson Yuan, Harvard Fellow at the NET. So my first question is about constitutionalism, the implementations of constitutionalism in Asian countries. Often constitutionalism are linked to good governances. And we have a lot of like electoral democracy in Asian countries already, but they often doesn't perform well. And that's why people are willing to promise their freedom or basic human rights to strong armed leaders. For example, in Hong Kong, the ongoing elections of the head of the government, people are willing to sacrifice their to compromise their freedom or demand on constitutional democracy to a relatively good performance candidate. So how should constitutionalism promoted to people who already lose their confidence to liberal democracy? And my second question is about citizenship and constitutionalism. As Professor Goldstone said, the promotions of the human rights discourse should emphasize dignity and also security. And often authoritarian government, they offer security and dignity. And on the dignity side, they usually would use nationalism as a divergence of people. So they diverse people anger to immigrants or to state enemies in order to satisfy their needs of dignity. And this is related to my second question, which is often in Asian context, political conflict are based on cultural, religious, and ethics groups. And in Myanmar context, it's hard to open a dialogue to Buddhists on the Rohingya problem, because at the very first place, that Rohingya are not regarded as citizens of Myanmar. So with these barriers of citizenships, how should the dialogue of building constitutionalism start within these countries?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark Plattner.
Thank you. My question really was prompted by the first two questions asked in the last round, and I hope it hasn't been overtaken by events or exhausted yet. And really, they started me thinking about what exactly constitutionalism is. And it seems obvious at first, but does it mean mainly respect for the Constitution? Or does it have some substantive character? I mean, Jack Goldstone seems to suggest that it does. It depends on accountability, perhaps separation of powers. Can there be such a thing as constitutionalism in a system that's not democratic? It reminds me of discussions of rule of law, which is something else one might perhaps not equate, but tie to the notion of constitutionalism. Is the rule of law as such necessarily democratic? Can you have a non-democratic rule of law? So, Michael, your very interesting presentation started me off thinking on all these things. If you have any comments, I'd welcome them. Thank you.
Very good. And Susan Alberts.
Well, my question is Mark's question. I was going to ask you, what is your definition of constitution?
You have the microphone.
Do I need it?
Yes.
Oh, okay. My question is also, how do you define constitutionalism? I have my own answer. And the one reason I think it's important to clarify, too, is that the way you answer could lead to a certain research program because it will lead to certain other questions. Some of the discussion, too, especially the first couple questions where you were talking about commitment, respect. I mean, in many emerging democracies, there is not already respect. You may intend to respect, but power is involved, too. So however much you may want to respect your basic laws, there are always power and other constraints or temptations. But so if constitutionalism means respect for or adherence to constitutional principles, this may suggest, or I'm wondering if what you would think about adding to your suggestions for research and scholarly engagement is a very, very vital question. Why play by these rules? Why would powerful political actors adhere to these basic democratic rules and processes that actually limit their power? And, you know, it's an empirical question as well as, is there a theory of institutional design? What is civil society's roles? Anyway, thank you.
I think since we're coming to the end of our time, I'm going to ask our discussants to answer first and then give the final word to Michael, or words to Michael. So I don't know if either Don or Jack would like to jump in. Don?
Well, I'm not sure I know what constitutionalism is in a way that can be encapsulated in a definition. I'm a little bit like Potter Stewart on that question. I know it when I see it, but that's, I mean, that's not good enough. I do think that the effort to make it clear is important. I was 1,000 years ago, I was a teaching fellow in a course on constitutionalism in America. And a book came out of that, not a book authored by any of the teaching fellows, but by the professor who was teaching the course. And it's a book that's sat on many shelves, gathering quite a lot of dust. So I'm not sure I want to take a stab at a formal definition. Of course, it has something to do with respect for rights of citizens. I mean, one can do a laundry list definition of it, but it's very unsatisfying because a laundry list can never take care of the ism part of the term. Can you have a rule of law in authoritarian regimes? Well, let's think about the sort of partial rule of law you have in Singapore. If you and I are Singaporeans and we have a dispute, we can take it with great confidence to the courts, and they will, in Singapore, assuming that's where we are, and maybe we're Singapore citizens, we can take it with great confidence to the courts, and I think get a very considerable amount of justice. If, on the other hand, you have a dispute with the government of Singapore or with a particular politician in Singapore, and especially the latter, because whereas the government can't collect damages for libel, individual politicians can, libel and slander, and that's the way politicians are disarmed traditionally in Singapore. So does Singapore have a rule of law? It's sort of got some semblance of rule of law, but with a very large category of exceptions. And I think it's fair to say that Singapore is not a fully fledged democracy. It's getting a little bit better and softer, but it's far from being there. Susan Albert's question, why would democratic actors agree? To the rule of law, I assume. Here we do have some evidence. There are a lot of studies of what generates respect for the rule of law among politicians. And the studies more or less come to the same conclusion. That is that the rule of law flourishes where there's active political competition. So that today's rulers may be tomorrow's opposition, and they want to be sure there's some protection for them if that eventuality should occur. So that's a pretty slim reed on which to walk, if you like, to mix metaphors. But it's the foundation of the rule of law in quite a lot of countries. And where there's one overwhelmingly dominant party, as there has been in Japan for most of its existence, the courts tend to be quite ineffectual. Where, on the other hand, there's a lot of competition and there can be alternation in office, the rule of law tends to be better off. If you want references, I can give them to you.
Yes, I'm flanked here by two immensely impressive and accomplished lawyers. And so when you ask about constitutionalism, their view may be different. I'm a sociologist. So from my perspective, when I look at what were people fighting for in the constitutional revolutions in France, America, Britain, Iran, other countries, they were fighting to create a government of laws rather than a government of men. It's a cliche, but it mattered immensely to people that they felt their lives and future would be governed by laws that they would help create, rather than the decisions of one or a few individuals over which they would have no control. It's a very different issue than democracy. Britain in the 1700s was not a democracy, but it did have a constitution of sorts. America with slavery and women excluded from the vote, very limited democracy, but certainly people were actively engaged in creating a constitutional regime. It was faulty, it needed to be expanded to truly be democratic, but the goal was to make sure that things were always subject to review. The challenges to constitutionalism, when we have an official in the White House say the president in national security has supreme authority, is a defiance of constitutionalism. In that sense, I think you know it when you see it there, when you hear that. Everything must be reviewable under law, I think, in a constitutional regime. And what we see, the contrast is what's happening in South Korea versus what's happening in China. Some people look at what's happening in South Korea and say, look at the instability, look at the corruption, look what can happen, how badly things can go in a democracy. But at the end of the day, what I think needs to be highlighted is that even the head of state can be held accountable under law. In China, you can have a vigorous anti-corruption regime, but if it can never touch those who are at the head of that, then you don't have constitutionalism, no matter how much they talk about rule of law and no matter how much they talk about combating corruption. So I think the principles are there to understand what constitutionalism is, and a lot of people who fight for it know it very well.
Thank you, Jack. Now, the last words to Michael. We are coming to the end of our time, but I'm sure that you will summarize your thinking with the same succinctness that you did when you spoke.
So I get one word?
You have 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Thank you.
I noticed that Jack kind of closed with, I know it when I see it argument ultimately after all that analysis.
And on that note.
I think the question that Mark raises, I'll start with that. I don't think you can have the rule of law without democracy. I had an experience with that once. Martin Lee was giving a speech on why Hong Kong needed democracy. And the next day, professors at my faculty wrote an op-ed in the newspaper that Martin Lee doesn't appreciate the calling of common law judges, that they can save us. And so then Martin calls me up that morning and says, Mike, did you read that op-ed? I says, yeah, Martin, you should respond. And he said, I had in mind that you should respond. So I went on for a couple weeks in dueling op-eds in the newspaper over this. But it kind of puts me back to, I think it was Guillermo O'Donnell said, the problem with the rule of law without democracy is the dictator is unable to make himself unable to interfere whenever it's expedient. And this is what you see. And even in Hong Kong, as there's some kind of erosion of the rule of law, China does what it wants. So when it feels that it didn't like what the courts might do over oath-taking, China steps in. So they interfere when it's expedient. And I think that element of expediency sort of undermines the rule of law as a concept. Yes, what Don says is correct. You could almost say Singapore is a halfway house. So rule of law in some areas and not in others. But and you could look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong doesn't have democracy, and still it's rated number 1 in the world, I think, in the rule of law. But I think this is kind of like an insurance policy rule of law. It's an exceptional case that they bought insurance from Beijing, guaranteeing that Hong Kong would remain the same for so long. And of course, even that insurance is starting to get tattered, right? Starting to worry about it. So I think that's my answer to that. I think why people accept rules and so on, I think, well, I'm not sure it was Jack or Don raised the question that they look down the road and they themselves may be subject to problems, they want to be protected down the road. Tom Ginsburg has written on this, and he's in effect arguing, I call it the rational choice theory. I tend to think it just comes to legitimacy. I don't think rational choice is sufficient in this, because I'm kind of a critical studies person, and I think over time your rationality keeps evolving. But I think legitimacy is probably at the heart of it, and I think I would just leave that one with that. Not regarded as citizens. I think when you have groups of people that are in and out, Tibetans are like that as well. They're both in China, in China's theory, but yet they don't view themselves as part of China. They're sort of occupied. I kind of disagree with Don. I think some kind of asymmetry can work in those cases, but not in the way he described it. I've written on Tibet in the Journal of Democracy. I mean, this question of, I call it the case for Chinese federalism, and I think a non-asymmetric federalism in the Chinese mainland, but when it comes to dealing with China's periphery, you could have a model of federalism that's kind of like the European Union's model of confederacy, where the periphery, no one's dominating in that. In effect, even the small players have a voice in that peripheral community. I think this might be gain less resistance than the center trying to repress everybody and oppress them. I think China, this is kind of Newton's law. The more China, it happens in Hong Kong as well, the more it pushes, the more they push back. So is there a way to design around that? It's something we're probably never going to know, because China's probably never going to consider it. But in any case, I think that's the way of dealing with these communities on the side. I think Hong Kong was widely accepted as different by most Chinese. I don't think most Chinese had any problem with it. This nationalism stuff only came after China tried to sort of change the rules and repress Hong Kong, and Hong Kong pushed back, and now China has stirred up a kind of resistance to Hong Kong model across China. But up until 2 or 3 years ago, I think most mainland Chinese were fine with Hong Kong having a sort of asymmetric location within China. Yep.
Well, the International Forum for Democratic Studies combines scholarship with democratic practice, and I think today's panel has really shown the great value of scholarly exchange. And I want to thank our all-star cast here for a tremendous panel, and invite you all to join me in giving them a round of applause.